stories of human beings transforming can really compel us to think differently about ourselves. And it was the stories of people who had been through really difficult things and come out the other end. They had a sense of wisdom, of perspective, of what matters most. And those were the stories that stuck with me.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Crazy Good Turns, the podcast that recognizes and celebrates people who do great things for others. I'm your host, Frank Blake, and I am very excited about today's guest, Kimi Culp. Kimi produces and hosts the All the Wiser podcast, a really interesting podcast. All the Wiser takes on difficult topics that most people might want to avert their gaze from. Kimi profiles people who've been put in painful and sometimes seemingly impossible situations and then explores what they learned along the way. Her guests show great courage in sharing their stories, and I'd say Kimi is similarly courageous in her storytelling. She asks tough questions, but also displays great compassion. Before launching the podcast, Kimi had a successful career working at several major broadcast networks. She's been a producer for The Today Show, Good Morning America, and The Oprah Winfrey Show. She was also an executive in charge of talent and development for Oprah's network. During our interview today, she'll share the realization that she had while in effect on the top of a mountain that made her leave that world behind and which set her on her path today. She and I will discuss what makes a great story and how to tell it well, the overarching lessons that she learned from her guests on the show, her work on the excellent documentary Gleason, which captures the experience of an NFL player battling against Lou Gehrig's disease, and which is, I think, just an outstanding tribute to human courage and faith. We'll also talk about the toughest story Kimi has ever told on her podcast. And lastly, towards the end of our interview, you'll hear a special surprise we have for Kimi. In this episode, I think we'll see that we're blessed to live in a time where technology enables us to hear directly from someone who has an important and interesting story to tell. Kimi Culp has dedicated herself to capturing some of those important and interesting stories, and I think you're going to find that her own story is pretty inspiring too. Here's our interview with Kimi Culp. Kimi, this is such a delight to have you on the podcast. I'm such a fan of your podcast, so welcome to Crazy Good Turns.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
So since 2019, you've been creating and hosting just a terrific podcast that I hope all of our listeners take the time and listen to. The podcast is called All the Wiser. And I think it's fair to describe the theme of your shows, and I've heard this from others, is you tell compelling stories about the hope and possibility that's at the other end of pain. Is that a fair general description?
Yes, well said.
And so my first question to you is, why that theme? Why did you start a podcast with that as a theme?
I was a journalist for decades before and have always been just deeply passionate and to some extent obsessed with the notion that stories of human beings transforming can really compel us to think differently about ourselves. And it was the stories of people who had been through really difficult things and come out the other end. They had a sense of wisdom, of perspective, of what matters most. And those were the stories that stuck with me. So All the Wiser was very intentional about finding and sharing those stories in a really thoughtful way. So it was from my career in journalism. And then I also, live with bipolar disorder and had hit it for 2.5 decades. So I think understanding suffering and how other people endure and learn and grow was an impetus that I hadn't really acknowledged until, deep into the show and realizing I had my own story.
What impresses me most about your podcast is not only do you tell great stories, you are a great storyteller, but also the stories that you choose to tell are such interesting and sometimes difficult stories. And I wonder what, in your view, what makes a great story? How do you choose the stories that you tell?
As far as the model of storytelling, the goal on the other end is to inspire people, to educate people about something they didn't know, which may be as simple as standing in someone's shoes. The vehicle to do that is by keeping them entertained and engaged. So the model that I know works when executed and done well is a high stakes story, high stakes narrative. So somebody is transformed in the process. In our podcast, the high stakes middle, the sort of dark night of the soul, are really stories that some are incredibly, harrowing, unbelievable, unthinkable, but the growth and, that happens in that process and perseverance and resilience and is really powerful. So I think it's that high stakes narrative, an engaging story with a clear intention of how the story is ultimately of service to others.
So, and again, when our listeners look at the range of topics that you've tackled on your podcast, from Amanda Knox, who was one of your guests, to someone who was in the Nexium Culp as a guest, I mean, a wide range of guests. Are there some common learnings that you get from all of these different, as you say, quite profound and difficult stories?
Yes, people matter most. Your relationships. So nurturing those, because unexpected things come our way and everybody goes back to that. I interviewed somebody yesterday who had been in prison for 26 years for crimes he committed as a 16-year-old boy. And I also had one of the great privileges of my career to interview Edith Eger, who's a 94-year-old Holocaust survivor who published her first memoir at 90. So Fernando, this 41-year-old man who was incarcerated his entire life, and Edith Eger said the exact same thing of how one endured Auschwitz, one endured living in a cement existence, hellish. And so what they both said is all they could control was their mind and their attention. So they would close their eyes, and Edith Eger would go to recipes and memories in the kitchen with her mom. And Fernando would go to visions of his siblings' children and trees. And so the only thing they could control was their mind and their thoughts. And they both described the exact same experience.
That's really interesting. Are there other common themes that come through?
I mean, that one is pretty consistent. People say it in different ways. I just found it remarkable that they said the exact same thing, that they would close their eyes and go there. So I think it's that relationships matter most. And everybody who's on the podcast is standing in their truth and they're honoring it and they're sharing it. On the other end of that is, I believe it's cathartic for them, and their story all of a sudden becomes of service to others who are going through their own suffering. That, the bravery to share, I think is really cathartic. I think the idea of our thoughts and how powerful they are, and in being conscientious of the people we care about most and making time, because it really matters.
You have had just an extraordinary career in journalism, in lots of different media, TV, films. You've written a book, you speak, you're a speaker, and you obviously have the podcast. Are there differences in the media that you've observed as you basically go forward in your journalistic career? And is there something that you think is particularly good or particularly problematic about podcasts?
I love podcasts because I don't believe that there is a more intimate format to share stories that exists today. So the idea that you are with somebody in their ears as they're walking, as they're folding their laundry, as they're waiting for their kids in carpool is that type of storytelling. When you think about short form content on YouTube or Instagram, some of these new ways of emerging media, the intimacy and human connection to me don't really exist. And I loved television and film, but television at the end of the day often is driven by advertising, and you're sort of selling cereal boxes. How many viewers can we get? So things can get sensational, and I think that can be an issue that television journalists are wanting to do stories of integrity, and you're bumping up against that. So I'm all in podcasts because of the power and intimacy and engagement that they provide the listener.
So looking at your career, and again, for the listeners, you've worked for major broadcast networks, you've worked for Oprah Winfrey, you've had your own firm going out and working with others. Was there a turning point in your own career in saying, what I want to do is tell longer stories, and if I can do more documentaries or do more podcasts, that's what I want to do, versus continuing to pursue maybe what might be a more typical career in broadcasting and journalism?
100%. Yes. It was sort of what I just spoke to. The cost of working for these big media companies is massive amount of hours of travel. And when you don't feel great, like the benefit of the stories you're telling are moving the world forward in a better place, that cost is too high. So I left places where we had a baked-in audience of 5 million people we could distribute to a day. And I went and started doing cause content. So we were working for the Gates Foundation, interviewing, teachers in inner city schools.
So stop right there just for a second, because before you slide, that sounds like, oh yeah, logical decision to move. That's got to be a big decision, because at the time you were with Oprah's network.
Yeah.
That, as you say, that's huge. Was that a scary decision, or no? Yes. It was just so obvious. Okay. So what got you over the fright?
I went on a very rare vacation because I needed time off by myself, and I hiked to the top of the mountain, and I
Is that literally top of a mountain, or
literally? It was a hike. Yeah, it was a hike in San Diego, and I was exhausted. I had young kids, and I went away to be by myself and take care of myself, and it just became so clear to me when I had time to be still and be in nature and be away, that I was sort of felt like I was hovering above my life and looking down. And I just said, I think I can go out and do this on my own in a different way. And so I did.
Was it pretty straightforward progress from that point on?
No.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So some of the bumps in the road.
Yeah. Well, first of all, identity, access. When you have this, at the time, it was one of the most powerful, well-resourced television shows in the country, if not the world. So we had access to pursue these stories, to produce them at the highest level, to, have the finances and the distribution in place. And all of a sudden I'm like, well, I can do this on my own. And like, wow. Well, where am I going to find the 5 million people and the budget? And so, and the loss of identity, I think that I identified with my work.
I think that's such an interesting point. Yeah.
You kind of wake up and you go, you think, okay, like, who am I? What's next? And that can be hard.
And at what point did you kind of go, yeah, I've turned this corner now. I'm comfortable where my identity is. This is going well. If at all, it might still be an issue.
Yeah. I think I've evolved. I've tried different mediums, as you said, but, I started freelancing, and that work was here or there. So it would go, weeks, and then there would be a project, and there's some uncertainty around that. And when I started working, telling short form stories for causes, I think at some point it clicked to me that there can be an intersection of story and cause. Like, yes, you can, in fact, do this in a different model that feels aligned with my values. I don't even think I had taken a step back to say, is my work aligned with my values? So I think once that clicked for me, then I felt like, okay, this is a new identity and this feels more true to who I am.
And where in the process was your documentary Gleason, where you were one of the producers, which again, I recommend for all of our listeners. It's such a wonderful documentary. You might give some of the background to that.
So Steve Gleason is a former NFL football player who was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, at 32. And then 2 weeks later found out him and his wife, Michelle, were pregnant with their first child. He loved time-lapse photography. They started filming the deterioration of his body and the growth of their son. And two film students in New Orleans moved in. Michelle is my college roommate, and I was sort of in this freelance zone of what's next, and flew out to be with them, saw all this footage, and we decided they had set up in a garage to screen the footage, which was going to be a short film. And we brought it to LA to start a very small production company whose only job was to make that film.
And you showed it at Sundance, and it was nominated. I mean, you're very underplaying the impact of the documentary. And even if our listeners don't watch the actual documentary, which I think they should, just read the reviews. Just the reviews of it are inspiring. So incredibly well done.
Yeah, I think they gave us the percentage chance that we would get in Sundance. And I was like, well, yeah, that sounds like not happening. And then we got the call to Sundance and we went, and Amazon bought the film. I mean, the whole thing was unbelievable that any of it happened, but it did. And Steve's story was able to reach far and wide and make people think and understand the illness and understand, think about fatherhood. And it was an insane amount of work and deeply fulfilling.
Back to the podcast. So in 2019, you decide I'm going to launch this podcast. And as you've gone through this, are there I know it's always hard to pick out the episode that you like the most. I'll ask a different question. Instead of the episode that you like the most, was there one that was particularly difficult? And you just said, this is it's an important story, but boy, is it a tough story to tell.
Sue Klebold, Dylan Klebold's mom, the mother of the Columbine shooter, one of the more I feel a sense of ease going into these conversations. And it was a really hard conversation to have. And she was unbelievable. And it was a hard podcast episode to publish because we knew that not everyone believes that her voice should be heard or that her story is part of the narrative. So that was really difficult.
And did you know her previously? Because if I'm right, didn't you start as a reporter covering Columbine?
I was in college. I started as an intern.
As an intern?
And my first story was Columbine. So I was there. And then 26 years later, I have a conversation with Dylan's mom.
And
no, I didn't know her.
Okay.
It took writing letters, sending follow-up emails. As you can imagine, not a huge amount of trust with the media. And so it took time and effort to create a sense of trust that her story would be safe with us.
I'll ask the question you may not want to. Is there a show of yours that's your favorite? That you say, boy, if you had to listen to one, all the wiser, listen to this show.
There is the one I did yesterday is one of my favorite in the past 5 years, and that'll be published on June 30th. It's a man who was incarcerated as a boy. His name is Fernando, and he became a hospice worker within the prison, caring for the men that he had been incarcerated with. So walking through them with their final days. And so that is one of my favorite conversations I've had in years. And a great episode is Gary Mendel, who lost his son to addiction. And there was something about that conversation and connection that was really impactful. And people actually are very taken by the Sue Klebold. So I would listen to Gary Mindell, Sue Klebold.
They are all great. And you do something very unusual, which is you also, along with your podcast, donate to a charity. If you would, so your background, why did you decide to do that? And have there been any positive or negative surprises from making that charitable donation a part of your podcast efforts?
Yeah, so I touched on it a little bit, but when I left Oprah, we realized that nonprofits and large foundations needed to learn how to tell stories. And so I realized that that was a thing, as I said, and that it lit me up in a new way. So that intersection of story and cause beyond the storytelling to identify nonprofits that are moving the needle on the issues we talk about was really appealing to me, that one-for-one model. I, have always had a charitable heart and work with a family foundation. So made the pitch that this was a new way to make a difference and have the financial contribution aligned with the story and the theme of the story. Someone almost, not going to name, but a very large company in the media space almost bought the podcast and was going to bring me on and fully resource going big and finding these stories and sharing them. And why they ultimately didn't is because we had given so many charities and they would have to strip the content and affiliation.
No, yes. Seriously. Oh, that's tragic.
Not because they have cold hearts, but legal team.
No, I can understand exactly how it gets caught up in the propeller blade in a large company. Oh, that's so sad.
I know we were so far with the creative and the marketing, and then they called and said, we can't figure this piece out. And our team is saying no on that,
Wow. Well, are there, amongst the charitable donations that you've made, are there some that you just go, gosh, I'm so happy to have found this charity or brought this charity to the light of, a broader audience?
The first interview we ever did on the show 5 years ago was with the 9/11 firefighter. It's a $2,000 one-for-one contribution per story. He gave his money to a 13-year-old boy named Trey who had autism, who wanted to start a podcast called Trade Talks. I don't know if it's still on, to talk about autism and have people understand him and his differences and how we were more alike than people would think. So the first $2,000 went to a 13-year-old boy with autism who started a podcast.
Wow. That is so very, very cool. If you look out 5 years from now and think about your concept, what do you think it's going to look like?
I would love to tell stories in person. There's podcasts that are doing that very thing, doing pop-ups and having conversations. So I would love to gather people around these stories and do live interviews and conversations after with the guests. I think that could be really compelling and interesting. And I love visual media, so figuring out ways to have our stories be more dynamic and reach more people. So those are both, ambitions, and obviously reaching more people, right, so our impact grows.
Right. It strikes me that a lot of your shows deal with mental health. That's a recurring theme of a lot of your shows. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah. I wonder why.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've been very straightforward about your own issues with bipolar disease. And has the show helped you with that, or is it that's a element but not tied directly to the show?
I mean, the show is not about me. The show has changed me. The show created the space where I would openly talk about something I'd spent my entire life hiding from everyone I knew. And that changes you as a person. And once I worked through the shame and secrecy and fear of the telling of it, all of that weight is lifted. And now I'm able, moms call me, spouses call me, and it gives some meaning to the messier, harder parts of, this disease. On that note, it's changed my life.
That's a huge change. I think I was listening to another podcast where basically someone had you on as like an advice columnist.
Oh, that's a new thing. That's only happened in the past 6 months. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
I guess I'm an advice columnist.
Does that feel like...
I do have a podcast about wisdom, so I guess it's a fair, connection. But it's been really fun. But yeah, a few podcasts have had me on to give advice.
Yeah, no, I thought that was very interesting. That was, and your advice was always very wise advice. We always ask our guests on Crazy Good Turns, who has done a crazy good turn for you in your life? Who would you call out as someone who's just done something really wonderful for you? Unexpected.
Unexpected. Okay. I was going to go with my dad, who's just shown up for me.
Well, your dad's okay too. That works too.
That works too. My first boss, her name is Santina Lucci, and I only worked for her for a year. The way she believed in me, and I didn't believe in myself or what she was saying, but her belief in my potential and her enduring support for all the years I had nothing to do with her or her company. And that, I think, was really special. It was almost as if that teacher in elementary school, Santina, was that person for me professionally who saw something in me that before I saw it in myself.
That's terrific. And what did your dad do, as long as you mentioned him?
My dad has bipolar disorder. He was diagnosed at 50. He was a serial business entrepreneur and spent, I don't even remember much of him being around. And when I was diagnosed, he showed up by my side to walk this illness that he understood with me and kind of never left my side since. My dad is really something special in my life.
That's awesome. So I'm going to do what you do on your show. So we will contribute $2,000 to a charity of your choice. What's the charity and why are you choosing?
What?
Yeah.
This is unbelievable. Thank you. I am going to go with...
Sorry for springing that on you. I should have given you lots of time to think about it.
Team Gleason is now providing technology to people with ALS, which means they can speak with their eyes and read books to their children. And if they need to share their hearts or say their goodbyes, they can. And they're also helping the caretakers. And they currently have more patients in line than they can provide for. And $2,000 will get technology to a person who needs it. So Team Gleason.
Done. Kimi, I can't thank you enough again for being on the podcast. And our purpose here is to celebrate and recognize people who do great things for others. And your story and what you do is the perfect emblem of that. And thank you for that. And I think everybody who listens to your podcast will find an honesty and a courage and a wisdom that is really useful in life. And I'll make one other kind of editorial comment, which is I think we're blessed to live in a time where we have the technology that allows people to spend a half hour with you or an hour with you talking to someone who has an important and interesting story to tell. Because we didn't used to have that. That wasn't something that was available to us.
Frank, I am grateful for the opportunity to be on the show and spend some time reading about everything that you are doing in the world. And yeah, it's an honor to play a small part in the project, and really grateful to have met you.
Now, for the listeners who want to learn everything there is to know about you and what you're doing, what should they do?
allthewiserpodcast.com. And all of our episodes are there. We're on Instagram at All the Wiser Podcast. And if you want to learn more about my story, KimiCulp.com has a bunch on my past and my present and the podcast. So allthewiserpodcast.com would be the starting place.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Kimi. I really appreciate your time. All our listeners now download and review and give a great comment to All the Wiser. I hope you enjoyed that. What an interesting person and what an interesting journey her own life has taken, and how she does such a great job chronicling the lives of others. Before we wrap up today, I wanted to send a reminder that if you know of a great story, someone who's doing incredible work to help others, the team at Crazy Good Turns and I want to hear from you. Go to crazygoodturns.org/award-2023. That's crazygoodturns.org/award-2023. You can nominate a person or organization that matters to you on that page. Selected causes will get the chance to be featured in an upcoming episode of our podcast, and they'll also receive a $10,000 donation. So take a few minutes to nominate someone at crazygoodturns.org/award-2023. Also, please support our show by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting platform of your choice. Leave us a like or a comment there too. That's really helpful. As always, I want to thank the team that makes Crazy Good Turns possible. Our producers, Brian Sabin and Megan Hanlon, editing and mixing by Score, and Leslie Nunn for keeping this operation going forward. Lastly, I want to express my thanks to you, our listeners, for being part of a community that celebrates people who do good things for others. Your giving of your time to listen to these interviews and acknowledge these good deeds is, I think, a crazy good turn of its own. So thank you for your help. And I look forward to seeing you again soon in our next episode when we celebrate another crazy good turn. Thank you.